Pam Bondi had faced her share of challenges before. Years in the public eye had taught her that people could be unpredictable, and that the world of politics and law was never kind to those who showed any weakness. But nothing had quite prepared her for what happened that morning. She arrived at the state office feeling confident, dressed neatly, carrying her notes and plans for the day. She had a busy schedule ahead, meetings lined up, decisions to make, and she expected, as always, a professional reception. Yet, from the moment she stepped through the doors, something felt off. The usual warmth from the staff was missing. Instead, she sensed whispers, sideways glances, and a tension that prickled her skin. Bondi paused at the entrance, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just a busy morning, she thought. Staff members often had their own stresses, but the moment she entered the meeting room, she realized it was more than that. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. A few people smiled, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Others avoided looking directly at her, pretending to be absorbed in their papers or screens. She noticed a group of staff members clustered near the corner, exchanging glances that seemed meaningful in a way she didn't like. Their body language was deliberate, stiff, and she could almost hear the unspoken words. "Let's see how she handles this." Bondi took a deep breath and reminded herself not to react too quickly. She had learned long ago that losing composure was the first step to losing control. Still, she couldn't deny that the cold reception stung. She had walked into countless rooms over the years, faced opposition and criticism, but there was something personal about the way this felt. It wasn't just disagreement or debate, it was a quiet, deliberate attempt to make her feel small. She began the meeting with her usual professionalism, addressing each point on the agenda and speaking with clarity. But she couldn't help noticing the subtle jabs and interruptions from a few staff members. Comments were made in a tone that sounded casual but carried an edge. Papers would be shuffled just a little too loudly when she spoke. Phones would buzz at key moments as if someone had planned the distraction. Bondi caught a few smirks aimed in her direction, barely concealed, and she realized that this was not accidental. Someone had organized this, and the intention was clear. They wanted to embarrass her. Despite the awkwardness, she continued to speak with calm authority. She asked questions, guided the discussion, and tried to maintain focus on the work at hand. Yet each response from her colleagues felt like walking on a tightrope. She could feel the tension in the room thickening, like the air itself was waiting for a slip, a mistake, anything she could be criticized for. Her stomach tightened, and for a moment she felt the old familiar rush of anxiety that came before confrontation. But she pushed it down. She had handled difficult people before. She could handle this too. As the meeting went on, Bondi noticed more of the subtle attempts to undermine her. A few staff members would answer questions she had just asked, giving the impression that she didn't know what she was talking about. Others would challenge her points in ways that were slightly off, designed to make her seem out of touch rather than to contribute meaningfully. It was clever in a cruel way. This was not simply incompetence or difference of opinion. It was a calculated effort to shame her in front of others. Bondi's mind raced. She could feel the beginnings of a plan forming, but she reminded herself to wait. Reacting too soon could play right into their hands. She observed, taking mental notes of who was involved, how they communicated, and what their intentions seemed to be. She noticed small details. The way a hand would hover over a document, the way a pen would be tapped deliberately on the table, the way eyes would flick to one another for confirmation. Every gesture told a story. Every motion was part of a silent scheme. Despite the cold reception, she refused to let the situation control her emotions. She smiled when appropriate, nodded when necessary, and maintained a tone of authority that contrasted sharply with the subtle mockery around her. She noticed some staff members hesitated, caught off guard by her composure. It was a small victory, but an important one. She understood even then that power was not just about the position one held, but about how one carried oneself in moments of challenge. At one point, a staff member made a comment that was meant to sound helpful, but carried a thinly veiled insult. Bondi paused, considered responding, then chose to answer with a question instead, redirecting the conversation back to the topic at hand. It was a small maneuver, but it served two purposes. It prevented the insult from landing, and it subtly reminded everyone in the room that she was fully in control of the discussion. The room shifted slightly. though she knew some eyes were still calculating their next move. The more she observed, the more she realized that this was about more than just a single meeting. It was about dynamics and influence, about sending a message that she was not welcome, that she could be rattled, that others could assert control over her through humiliation. She had encountered similar situations in her career, though never in such a blatant, coordinated way. It was a test, she realized, and she intended to pass it with careful attention and strategic thinking. Bondi also began reflecting on her own reactions. She recognized the subtle pulse of fear and annoyance within her, and she deliberately turned it into focus. Instead of letting embarrassment cloud her judgment, she allowed herself to sharpen her awareness. She took note of who seemed most invested in the scheme, who looked for approval from others, and who remained silent but observant. Every detail would be important later. She understood that knowledge was power, and in this room power was being contested silently. Despite the undercurrent of hostility, she maintained a professional demeanor throughout the meeting. Her voice remained steady, her gestures calm, her expressions measured. But inside, her mind worked quickly, assessing, planning, and cataloging. She noticed patterns in behavior, the way certain staff members subtly reinforced each other, the small alliances that existed without being explicitly stated. She recognized that any reaction she made could be used against her, so she focused on observation rather than retaliation. By the time the meeting ended, Bondi had learned more than she had anticipated. She understood who was behind the subtle attacks, who had aligned themselves against her, and who might be swayed with careful communication. She realized that this situation was not about public knowledge or scandal. It was a private test of her authority and resilience, and while the sting of being intentionally embarrassed lingered, she felt a growing sense of clarity. She knew that the next steps would require patience, intelligence, and precise action. As she left the meeting room, she felt a mixture of emotions, discomfort, anger, and a keen sense of awareness. She walked down the hall with measured steps, aware of the eyes that followed her. Some staff members tried to mask their satisfaction. Others seemed uncertain. Bondi had learned a lesson that morning. People could be cruel when they underestimated you, and power was often tested in subtle, indirect ways. But she also knew that she had control over how she responded. The situation could be turned around, and she had already begun to form a plan in her mind. Outside the office, she paused for a moment, letting herself breathe. The morning had been difficult, more than she had expected, but it had also been revealing. She had seen who acted out of insecurity, who acted out of malice, and who might prove to be an ally. Every gesture, every comment, every whispered conversation had left a trace of information she could use, and as she prepared for the rest of her day, she felt a quiet determination growing inside her. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. Pam Bondi knew that challenges like these were part of life in the public eye, but she also knew that the way she responded would define not just the outcome of the day, but the perception of her strength and authority. And so, as she walked toward her next appointment, she did so with her head held high, ready to face whatever came next with strategy, patience, and unwavering composure. By the time she reached her car, the sting of the morning had dulled slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose. She understood that humiliation could be a tool used against her, but it could also be transformed into insight, knowledge, and eventually, power. The staff may have tried to shame her, but she was already turning the situation over in her mind, thinking carefully about the steps she would take. The first part of her journey was over. She had survived the initial test. She had observed, recorded, and controlled her emotions. And most importantly, she had begun to see the way forward. Bondi knew that patience would be essential, that intelligence and subtlety would be her greatest allies, and that the staff who tried to undermine her would soon learn that she was not easily shaken. The morning had been tense, uncomfortable, and revealing. But for Pam Bondi, it was also the first step in turning the tables, in showing that respect was not something that could be taken lightly, and in proving that true strength often came from composure, strategy, and quiet determination. She was ready for the next challenge, and she knew that the story was only beginning. After the tense meeting, Pam Bondi took a moment alone in her office to gather her thoughts. The hallway and meeting room were behind her now, but the feelings from that morning lingered. The whispers, the glances, the subtle attempts to make her feel small, They all replayed in her mind like a film she couldn't pause. She knew she could not let it go unaddressed, but she also knew that rushing into confrontation would be a mistake. In situations like this, patience and observation were far more powerful than quick reactions. Bondi sat down at her desk and opened her notebook. She began writing what she remembered from the meeting. Who said what, who smiled when they shouldn't have, who whispered with whom, who avoided eye contact, and who tried to assert dominance in subtle ways. Every detail mattered. She understood that the smallest piece of information could become a key in understanding the bigger picture. Her years of experience had taught her that people revealed themselves in the tiniest gestures, the smallest inconsistencies, and she was determined to notice everything. She reflected on the staff members who seemed most invested in the subtle humiliation. There were a few whose behavior was coordinated, almost rehearsed. They had been watching each other for cues, ensuring that every comment, every gesture reinforced the impression they wanted to create. Bondi understood that these were not isolated actions. They were part of a silent plan, aimed at testing her authority and making her feel vulnerable. The realization made her both cautious and curious. She wanted to understand their motives fully before taking any action. Rather than reacting immediately, Bondi decided to gather information. She began reaching out to colleagues she trusted, those who were not involved in the subtle schemes, to understand the dynamics from different perspectives. She asked questions carefully in casual tones, making it seem as if she was seeking general insight rather than investigating specific people. Slowly, she pieced together a clearer picture of the relationships, alliances, and power plays within the office. Each conversation gave her a little more understanding, a little more leverage. She also paid attention to the less obvious staff members, the ones who seemed quiet and passive during the meeting. While they had not directly participated in the humiliation, their silence could either indicate fear or a hidden alignment. Bondi knew that in situations like these, allies could come from unexpected places, and those who seemed uninvolved might be swayed with the right approach. Her plan had to account for everyone, not just those who were actively antagonistic. As the day progressed, Bondi began observing behavior more closely. She noticed subtle patterns. Certain staff members avoided her gaze when she entered a room, while others seemed to be testing her reactions with small, almost imperceptible provocations. Some whispered under their breath when she spoke, but quickly stopped when they realized she was watching. It became clear that the staff were not just testing her knowledge or competence. They were testing her patience, her composure, and her ability to maintain control under pressure. Bondi realized that responding too quickly could give them exactly what they wanted. If she reacted emotionally, if she showed frustration or embarrassment, it would validate their efforts and shift the balance of power in their favor. Instead, she chose a different strategy: observation and careful documentation. She began keeping a private log of interactions, noting the timing, tone, and context of each subtle slight or insult. This log was not just a record. It was a tool for understanding behavior, predicting actions, and planning her next steps. By mid-afternoon, she decided to test the dynamics subtly. In a meeting with a smaller group, she asked questions designed to draw out honest responses without appearing confrontational. She noticed who tried to dominate the conversation, who attempted to manipulate the narrative, and who provided genuine input. This exercise revealed more than she had expected. Some staff members were clearly attempting to position themselves as experts, challenging her knowledge in ways that were more about image than substance. Others were hesitant, caught between fear of conflict and the desire to protect themselves. Bondi began to see the true landscape of influence within the office. Throughout the day, she also reflected on her own feelings. The sting of embarrassment from the morning had not disappeared, but she consciously chose to convert it into focus and strategy. She recognized the temptation to feel anger or resentment, but she refused to let it cloud her judgment. Instead, she used it to heighten her awareness, to sharpen her observations, and to refine her plan. She understood that control over her emotions was as important as control over the situation itself. Bondi also considered the potential consequences of her actions. Every step she took had to be calculated, not just to protect herself, but to maintain professional integrity. She wanted to address the subtle humiliation without creating unnecessary conflict or drama. Her goal was not revenge, it was clarity, fairness, and re-establishing authority in a way that was both strategic and ethical. She knew that perception mattered as much as reality in the public and professional arenas, and her approach had to be flawless. By the evening, Bondi had compiled a comprehensive understanding of the situation. She knew who was actively working against her, who could be swayed, and who was neutral. She had identified patterns of behavior, alliances, and motivations. Most importantly, she had reaffirmed her own principles: calmness, observation, patience, and strategy. She realized that the morning's challenge had been an opportunity, revealing not just the intentions of others but also her own capacity to respond thoughtfully and decisively. That night, she reflected quietly in her home. The memory of whispered remarks and sideways glances lingered, but instead of frustration, she felt clarity. She began mapping out her approach for the coming days. Her plan would not be overtly aggressive. It would be subtle, precise, and effective. She would use observation, careful communication, and selective action to gradually shift the dynamics in her favor. She would ensure that professionalism and competence were at the forefront, exposing any attempts to undermine her without appearing vindictive. Bondi also thought about the people around her who could serve as allies. She considered reaching out to them strategically, strengthening relationships and ensuring she had support from those who were capable, trustworthy, and aligned with her goals. She recognized that influence was rarely about single acts of authority. It was about relationships, trust, and perception over time. By carefully cultivating these elements, she could create an environment where her leadership was recognized and respected. As she planned, she also rehearsed responses mentally. She envisioned possible scenarios, meetings, conversations, and interactions, and considered how to respond with calm authority. She thought about the staff members who had tried to subtly undermine her, and how she could respond in ways that were effective, yet measured. This mental rehearsal helped her maintain control over her emotions and ensured that when the next challenge arose, she would be ready. The next morning, Bondi returned to the office with a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer reacting to the staff's behavior. She was anticipating it. She observed quietly, took mental notes, and engaged selectively. She spoke with precision, asked questions that revealed hidden motivations, and subtly redirected conversations when necessary. Each action was deliberate, designed to demonstrate competence and authority without creating open conflict. Over the next few days, Bondi continued her careful observation. She noted how staff members reacted to her calm authority, how alliances shifted when she engaged strategically, and how subtle dynamics changed when she remained composed. She realized that the office was a complex ecosystem, with each individual contributing to the overall atmosphere. Understanding this ecosystem allowed her to navigate it with confidence, gradually turning a challenging situation into an opportunity for influence and respect. Bondi also began documenting her observations in more detail. She created charts, notes, and timelines, recording not just what happened but why it might have happened. This documentation was private, but it served as a guide for her strategy. It allowed her to see patterns, predict behavior, and plan her actions with precision. She knew that careful preparation would be far more effective than impulsive reactions, and she committed herself to this approach. By the end of the week, Bondi had transformed her perspective. The initial embarrassment and discomfort had been replaced by focus and clarity. She had identified key players, understood their motivations, and developed a subtle, strategic approach to manage the situation. She had reinforced her own principles of calmness, patience, and observation, and she was ready to take the next steps. The staff who had tried to undermine her were still unaware of the depth of her awareness and the careful planning she had undertaken. Bondi understood that turning the tables would not happen overnight. It required patience, intelligence, and careful execution, but she also knew that she was capable. The challenge had revealed more than just the intentions of others. It had revealed her own strength, her capacity for strategy, and her ability to navigate complex human dynamics. She felt ready, confident, and prepared to face whatever came next. Bondi entered the office that morning with a quiet confidence that was different from the previous week. The sting of the subtle humiliation had faded, replaced by a steady sense of purpose. She had observed, she had taken notes, and she had formulated a strategy. Today she would begin to subtly turn the tables. Her approach was careful, measured, and precise. She knew that overt confrontation could backfire, but small, intelligent actions could shift the balance of power without anyone realizing it at first. Her first step was to engage directly with those staff members who had been most involved in undermining her. She approached them with professionalism, asking for their input on ongoing projects and acknowledging their expertise. On the surface, her tone was neutral, even warm. But every question she asked was designed to reveal competence or the lack of it in a subtle way. When one of them gave an incomplete or inaccurate response, Bondi would gently correct it, framing her correction as clarification for the group rather than a direct challenge. The effect was immediate. The staff members' confidence wavered slightly, and others in the room noticed the subtle shift. Bondi also used questions strategically. Rather than accusing or confronting, she asked for explanations, details, and reasoning. When someone attempted to challenge her knowledge, she would respond with calm, precise questions that highlighted gaps in their argument without ever appearing aggressive. It was a delicate balance, enough to expose the flaws in their approach but not enough to create open conflict. She could see even in those early moments that staff members were beginning to hesitate. The power dynamic, once subtly against her, was starting to tilt. At the same time, Bondi worked to strengthen relationships with staff members who had remained neutral or who could be swayed. She took time to check in with them, ask for their opinions, and acknowledge their contributions. These interactions were genuine. She understood that trust and respect were earned through consistent, thoughtful engagement. By fostering these connections, she was slowly creating a support network within the office. People who would observe her fairness and competence and begin to see the contrast between her leadership and the petty tactics of the others. Bondi also paid careful attention to her communication style. She spoke clearly, calmly, and without haste. She allowed moments of silence to exist, letting staff members fill them with unnecessary words or revealing gestures. Her body language was open but authoritative. She maintained eye contact without intimidation, smiled without condescension, and positioned herself in a way that naturally drew attention when she entered a room. Every detail mattered, and she used every small tool at her disposal to assert subtle authority. One morning during a team discussion, a staff member attempted to interrupt her with a dismissive comment. Bondi paused, looked at the person, and then redirected the conversation with a simple, calm statement that framed the discussion around facts and objectives rather than opinions. She did not raise her voice, she did not show anger, and yet the effect was powerful. The staff member paused, taken aback by the quiet authority she displayed. The room seemed to shift imperceptibly, and others began to adjust their behavior accordingly. Bondi noted this internally. Calm, deliberate responses were more effective than confrontation. She also began documenting each interaction more meticulously. This was not just a record for her own reference. It was a tool to understand patterns of behavior and predict future actions. She noted who reacted with defensiveness, who tried to assert dominance, and who remained observant, but silent. Each detail contributed to a clearer picture of the office dynamics. By understanding these patterns, she could plan her next steps with precision, ensuring that every action she took had maximum effect and minimum risk. Bondi's strategy extended to meetings with higher-ups as well. She presented her work clearly, highlighted achievements, and subtly underscored the professionalism and competence of those who supported her. She avoided drawing attention to the conflicts with staff directly, but ensured that her own authority and expertise were evident. It was a careful balancing act, demonstrating competence without seeming vindictive, reinforcing authority without creating open confrontation. And it worked. Observers began to notice her calm command and strategic intelligence, even if the staff attempting to undermine her did not fully understand what was happening. In the hallways, during casual interactions, Bondi practiced subtle psychological tactics. She smiled at staff members when appropriate, engaged in light conversation, and acknowledged contributions openly. These small gestures created an atmosphere where competence and professionalism were valued over petty games. Staff members who had tried to shame her began to notice the shift. They realized that their subtle attacks were no longer producing the intended effects. Instead of making her look weak, they were highlighting her skill and composure. Bondi also found opportunities to expose inconsistencies or errors, but always in a professional, non-confrontational manner. For example, when a staff member presented information that was slightly misleading, she would ask clarifying questions in front of the group. The questions were neutral but precise, prompting the person to reveal the gaps in their own statements. It was a subtle way of asserting authority and correcting misinformation without appearing aggressive. The staff member who had hoped to appear clever instead revealed their lack of preparation. Bondi's reputation for competence quietly grew, while the subtle attempts at humiliation backfired. Another important element of her approach was timing. Bondi knew that patience was as important as strategy. She did not react to every slight or provocation immediately. Sometimes she let things pass, observing reactions and gathering more information. Other times she acted decisively, but always in a calculated way. This careful balance kept staff members uncertain, preventing them from predicting her responses and undermining their confidence. Over time, this uncertainty became a tool, creating a sense of respect mixed with caution. Bondi also leveraged her ability to frame narratives subtly. When discussing projects or tasks, she highlighted facts, outcomes, and clear reasoning. She avoided making the conversation about personalities or past grievances. Instead, she focused on transparency, logic, and shared goals. By doing so, she shifted attention away from office politics and toward objective results. Staff members who had attempted to undermine her found that their tactics no longer had impact in discussions where facts and professionalism were at the forefront. Throughout the day, she continued to monitor body language and subtle interactions. She noticed when staff members hesitated before speaking, when glances were exchanged, and when someone seemed uncomfortable with their own behavior. These observations were valuable. They indicated that her strategic, calm approach was already affecting the dynamics. Staff members who had hoped to assert dominance through subtle humiliation were now adjusting their behavior in response to her composed authority. Bondi also began preparing for longer-term strategies. She considered how to handle future meetings, potential challenges, and moments where staff might attempt similar tactics again. She understood that consistency was key. One decisive action or calm response could not be a one-time occurrence. It had to be repeated and reinforced over time. By planning ahead, she ensured that her approach would remain effective and sustainable, gradually establishing her authority and credibility across the office. In the days that followed, subtle changes became more apparent. Staff members who had previously whispered or exchanged knowing glances now hesitated before acting. Those who had attempted to dominate conversations or undermine her subtly were more cautious. Bondi noticed that their confidence had waned slightly, while her own reputation for professionalism and strategic intelligence was growing. The environment was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, and she was at the center of that change. Bondi also took care to maintain a professional and approachable demeanor. She knew that fear alone was not respect. True authority required a balance of confidence, competence, and approachability. By remaining calm, respectful, and fair, she fostered an atmosphere where others were motivated to perform well, rather than engage in petty tactics. Staff members began to see her as a leader who commanded attention through skill and strategy rather than intimidation. Throughout this period, she remained mindful of the bigger picture. The subtle humiliation from the previous week was no longer the focus. Instead, she concentrated on building credibility, reinforcing professionalism, and demonstrating competence. Each action she took, each interaction she navigated, contributed to a larger narrative, that Pam Bondi was calm under pressure, intelligent and capable of handling complex dynamics without losing composure. The staff who had attempted to shame her were now learning that their actions had strengthened her reputation rather than diminished it. By the end of the week, Bondi had achieved a quiet but significant victory. The initial power struggle had shifted in her favor. Staff members who had tried to undermine her were now hesitant, unsure of how to act and cautious in their behavior. Bondi's strategy of calm observation, strategic questioning, subtle corrections, and relationship building had begun to pay off. She had turned a situation designed to embarrass. After weeks of careful observation and subtle maneuvering, Pam Bondi began to notice changes in the office dynamics. The staff who had tried to undermine her were acting more cautiously. Their whispered comments had become quieter, their smirks less frequent, and their attempts to interrupt or challenge her in meetings were measured. It was a gradual transformation, but it was undeniable. Bondi understood that change in human behavior often came slowly, and she continued to act with patience and strategy. Bondi knew that the influence of her approach extended beyond direct interactions. The way she carried herself, the calm and authoritative tone she maintained, and the way she handled challenges became visible signals to everyone in the office. Those who had been neutral or on the fence began to align more closely with her approach, noticing that she managed situations with fairness and intelligence. Her reputation for composure and competence was growing quietly yet steadily, and she could feel the subtle shift in the energy around her. One day, during a routine project review, Bondi noticed a staff member attempting to present incomplete information in a way that could mislead others. In previous weeks, a person like this might have successfully sown confusion or questioned her authority. But this time, Bondi handled it differently. She asked calm, pointed questions, allowing the staff member to reveal the gaps in their own statements. Instead of embarrassing them outright, she framed her intervention as clarification for the entire team. The effect was immediate. The staff member's confidence faltered, and the other employees observed her authority and expertise in a subtle but undeniable way. Bondi also began to encourage collaboration and transparency among the staff. She invited input from those who had remained quiet or hesitant, ensuring that their voices were heard and their contributions valued. By highlighting the strengths of different team members, she created an environment where competence was recognized, and petty attempts to dominate discussions lost their effect. Staff members who had previously relied on subtle humiliation now realized that their behavior no longer gave them the influence they had hoped for. Word of the subtle power shifts within the office began to spread, though not officially. People noticed Bondi's calm authority, her fairness, and her ability to manage complex dynamics without overt confrontation. Even staff who were initially skeptical or resistant started to observe her differently. Her ability to address issues directly but without aggression gained quiet respect. Bondi understood that leadership was not just about enforcing rules. It was about earning trust and demonstrating consistent competence over time. During another team meeting, one of the staff members who had previously been vocal in undermining her tried to challenge a recommendation she made. Bondi listened patiently, allowing them to speak, and then responded with thoughtful questions that highlighted the reasoning behind her suggestion. She never raised her voice or showed irritation, but the clarity of her argument and her professional demeanor left no room for doubt. Others in the room could see the contrast between her composure and the other person's increasingly defensive posture. It was a turning point. The subtle shift in authority that Bondi had been working toward was becoming visible. Bondi also started using informal moments to reinforce her presence and leadership. During lunch breaks or casual hallway conversations, she engaged with staff in ways that were approachable yet subtly authoritative. She listened attentively, acknowledged contributions, and asked questions that encouraged thoughtful responses. These small interactions built relationships, fostered respect, and subtly reminded everyone of her ability to balance professionalism with approachability. Her calm and consistent presence created an environment where respect and competence were valued more than petty games. At the same time, Bondi continued to observe the staff closely. She noticed that the individuals who had previously aligned themselves against her were now less likely to engage in subtle sabotage. Their confidence had been tempered by her quiet authority and the way she consistently highlighted professionalism and fairness. Others who had been on the sidelines began to step forward, offering constructive input and demonstrating commitment to their roles. Bondi recognized that leadership was as much about cultivating a positive environment as it was about addressing challenges directly. The subtle changes in the office were reinforced by Bondi's strategic communication. She made sure that her interactions, whether in meetings or casual settings, were clear, concise, and professional. She avoided drama, gossip, or personal attacks, focusing instead on facts, clarity, and results. This approach not only enhanced her credibility, but also highlighted the contrast between her calm, competent leadership and the petty tactics of those who had tried to undermine her. Staff members began to notice that competence and professionalism were valued more than cunning or manipulation. Bondi also began documenting outcomes more systematically. She recorded achievements, decisions, and progress in projects, ensuring that successes were visible and attributable to the right people. This documentation served multiple purposes. It highlighted her ability to manage effectively, created transparency, and subtly exposed any attempts to take credit unfairly. By keeping a clear record, she maintained control over the narrative and reinforced her authority without creating confrontation. During one particularly challenging project, a staff member attempted to bypass her by presenting incomplete information to a higher authority. Bondi calmly requested a meeting with both the staff member and the leadership team. In the discussion, she presented facts, clarified misunderstandings, and highlighted the contributions of the entire team. She did this without blame or accusation, focusing on accuracy and fairness. The result was that the staff member's attempt to undermine her backfired, and the leadership team recognized Bondi's competence and level-headed approach. The subtle power shift became more concrete, as even those who had been skeptical were now acknowledging her effectiveness. Bondi also noticed changes in informal interactions. Staff members who had previously whispered or exchanged knowing glances now seemed more measured in their behavior. They were cautious, aware that their subtle tactics were no longer effective, and that Bondi had the ability to respond strategically without confrontation. Even small gestures, such as avoiding unnecessary interruptions or being more thoughtful in meetings, reflected a growing respect for her authority. Bondi understood that these behavioral shifts, while subtle, were significant indicators of her influence taking hold. She continued to reinforce her authority through mentoring and guidance. By providing thoughtful feedback, offering support on challenging tasks, and recognizing individual contributions, she created a sense of shared purpose. Staff members began to see her as a leader who could navigate complex situations calmly and fairly, rather than someone to be challenged or undermined. The environment gradually transformed from one of subtle competition and tension to one where competence and collaboration were more valued. Bondi's approach also included carefully planned interventions when necessary. When a staff member made a mistake or attempted to manipulate a situation, she addressed it directly but professionally. She framed her responses as clarifications or learning opportunities, ensuring that the focus remained on facts and outcomes rather than personal blame. This method allowed her to correct errors, reinforce standards, and maintain authority without creating unnecessary conflict. It was a delicate balance, but Bondi executed it with precision, gradually reshaping the office dynamics in her favor. Over time, the staff who had attempted to shame her began to reassess their behavior. Some became more collaborative, recognizing that their previous tactics were ineffective. Others maintained distance, unsure of how to regain influence, while Bondi continued to demonstrate competence, fairness, and calm authority. The subtle shift in power was no longer just internal. It was becoming visible to anyone observing the office environment. Bondi's ability to turn a potentially humiliating situation into an opportunity for influence and leadership was now evident. The public perception of her professionalism also began to grow. Even within informal circles, colleagues from other departments and outside observers noted her calm, competent approach. They saw a leader who could handle complex interpersonal dynamics, manage challenges strategically, and maintain composure under pressure. Bondi's reputation for intelligence and professionalism was quietly but steadily expanding, reinforcing the subtle authority she had established within her own office. Bondi reflected on the progress she had made. The initial attempts by staff to undermine her had provided valuable insight into human behavior and office dynamics. By observing carefully, acting strategically, and maintaining composure, she had turned a situation designed to embarrass her into an opportunity to demonstrate leadership, competence, and authority. The office was now a different environment, where professionalism and respect had replaced subtle games and whispered attempts at humiliation. By the end of this period, Bondi had achieved a quiet but powerful transformation. The staff who had tried to shame her were no longer in control of the narrative. She had shifted the balance of power through careful observation, strategic communication, and